record in this computer because the cloud erases stuff. So, good morning, folks. Welcome to our second session. I like the discussion we had in the first, right? When we were talking about the problems of Philippine literature and perhaps the challenges that the industry faces. And today we're starting out well with as I said in the lecture, the longest period in our literary history, and sadly probably the one with the least material on it, right? The, our ancient pre-Hispanic literature. So let me just speak. I'll say a few things and then we can jump off from there. So the interesting thing about that period is that it's actually the one that reveals our, um, for lack of a better term, I don't want to use global, but like we kind of have to, our international, there you go, our international relationships at the time. Because I guess you guys know this from your Philippine history, but the Philippines was not a country before the Spaniards came. The Philippines was a bunch of kingdoms that uh, would war with each other, would trade with each other, and more interestingly, would trade with other countries and other people from other lands. So, um, for example, there is evidence that we interacted with, well, obviously China, we know, but we also interacted with India, and we do have certain artifacts and things archaeologically found that show that we had trade with India, as well as people of Indian descent who settled in the Philippines. And so we have, there is an international aspect to this region, right? And so when the Spaniards came, and it was really an arbitrary choice on their part to lump us together in the way that they did. I think they did it by really the islands that they went through, and they kind of said, oh, this group that we went through become our territory, and we'll call it the Philippines. Um, it does create some uh, issues with the people they conquered, because suddenly you're lumping together people who technically have nothing to do with each other except as traders, or even as sometime enemies. So that was something that the Philippines had to struggle with for a very long time. So the idea now of the Philippines being a nation, right, only really came out during the time of Jose Rizal. That was what, about 300 years after the initial conquest. So yeah, so that's something that we have to realize. The intriguing thing about that is, therefore, there's so much about our culture that we really do need to dig up. For example, the idea of the our ties with other countries. I've also found more recently, that there's an interesting thing about us as Filipinos, as a people from this region, in that we're now technically not Asians, right? We're being classified by other people um, as Pacific Islanders. And one of the reasons for that is because there's increasing evidence of our ties to uh, islands in the Pacific. So things like Polynesia, Micronesia, Hawaii. Um, it looks like we actually have ties to them. And there is a theory going around that our area, not the Philippines itself, but the area that the Philippines is in, could have been the point of origin for these people who ended up living in, um, Micronesia and Hawaii and all that. So we're seen as a possible, the area, not the Philippines itself, but uh, we're seen as a possible origin point for for those people. And the funny thing is, right, and I'm gonna show you a picture in a little bit. That's why I'm setting it up. But the funny thing is that what looks like I know is ano ba to? It looks like one of the ways that scientists have found this is there was a study in 2014 which studied livestock and and they were tracing the movements of livestock across the Pacific, and they were studying um, what livestock were brought from where and how could it possibly have gotten to where it has. So they looked at pigs and chickens and all that stuff. And what they realized was that chickens are very endemic to the cultures of, well, the Philippines and the Polynesian Islands and Taiwan and all of that. And they did a genetic study on the chickens, on the chicken bones. And what they found was that the chickens in those islands are genetically very closely related to the chickens in the Philippines. And so there is now this idea that if we were traveling by sea, they were transporting these chickens as food, right? And maybe things that they would carry with them to have when they settle wherever they were going to settle. But the chickens, therefore, must have come from here because they're tracing the movement of the chickens, and the chickens are from Africa. And so the movement is actually from Africa overland through China, and then it hits maybe top of the Hong Kong, Taiwan, Philippines, and then down to those islands. And so we're seen as a possible point of origin for these people. And so if you're looking at the movie Moana as a story of how the Polynesians um, occupied their islands, then you have to look at this guy as you know one of the points of evidence that we have to prove that hey, they must have at least come through the Philippines at a certain point. So hey the chicken is actually very important in the study of Pacific travels and Pacific what do you call it, expansion throughout history. So um, there, no, I found that very fascinating that we that's one of the points that we have. And what that really does is it reinforces the fact that we were an international point, right? We were a point where uh, people went through, and so the idea of uh, the Philippines as a primitive, which is what the Spaniards said, and this is what the Americans said also, is that we were primitive and we needed to be educated. It's really not true. It's just that we knew different things. We knew things different. We understood things differently. We had our own way of looking at things. So that's where we start. And I think uh, in the short piece that I put right on the canvas, I said that normally the three things that we should be looking at is number one, pre-Hispanic society had a more communal essence or idea of ownership than Western society. So things like, and we still see this in some indigenous tribes today, uh, taking only what you need. So, for example, an Eta is a nomadic. Etas are nomadic, so they don't really have a fixed place where they stay. When Etas travel through the mountains, they will pick fruit, but they will only pick fruit enough for um, their needs. They will never, let's say you see a mango fruit and it's full of mangoes, they will only get enough for them, and then they will leave the rest. And that the thinking there is because, well, there's somebody else who's going to come along, and they're going to want to eat, and so why will I take what should be theirs? Right. So that's kind of the thinking. And that applied to how we treated resources before. Now, it's not ours, it's everyone's. And therefore, it is wrong for us to take everything because what happens to the other people who who may need it, right? And that's one. The second one was unlike, let's say, again, going back to Western tradition. Unlike Western tradition, the language used in Filipino works, pre-Hispanic Filipino works, the language used was vernacular, was common. And the idea behind that was there was no there was no dedicated poet per se in those things. So for example, a session of bugtungan, right, riddle telling, can happen anywhere and be started by anyone, right? Um, or ambahan for that matter. It can happen during a celebration. It can happen while you're at work. It can happen when you're on your way to work. And it can be started by anyone and you can pick up from there and go along. So there is this idea that these literary forms weren't just exclusive to a certain class of people. Anybody can do it. And it was also because it was a form of entertainment for, the Hispanic Filipinos. They would tell each other these things because it was fun. And that's another interesting thing, right? There was no idea of um, the literary with the big L, which we have now, right? Writing and consuming things like that was not limited to um, a certain class of people. Everybody could do it. The epics that you read were told to everyone. They weren't told to just, let's say, the datus or the Harlikas. They were told to everyone. And so you realize then that our idea of stories and literature and all these things we're more, again, communal. We're more shared. No? And the last thing is they were oral tradition. As 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 I think King Doza Santiago said, not a lot were written down. I think a lot of the works were orally transmitted, and when they were taken down, when they were transcribed, some of them get Christianized because the people who took them down were priests. So we do have small adjustments that happen to these works as they were translated. So let's stop there first, right? I've taken up a good portion of time. I'll stop there and then I'll ask you, oh, what do you guys think naman? From what you've read so far? I'm not expecting you guys to have gone through it all already, although you may have already. Very quiet. Have you guys gone through it?
Hi, sir.
Hi.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Sorry?
Um, am I
Yeah.
audible?
Yeah, you are. You are. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that it's very interesting that the Filipinos of today are actually relearning pre-Hispanic practices that the Spaniards thought were outdated. So as you mentioned, the Atas have this practice of not take of only taking what you need and never from greed. It's sprouting up like wildfire, mushrooming all over the place in the form of community pantries.
Yeah.
And it's seen as a noble and very charitable act, but it's actually very common before in and how can Spaniards even see it as something primitive, something that is needing of teaching just because our beliefs before were different. And also I've noticed that we weren't really distinctive of gender before because in our language we have the use of siya, which didn't really distinguish from man or woman. And now
Mm.
through the rise of feminism, we're seeing people not wanting to distinguish, like just because of the assigned birth. So, sir, what do you think of? I know it's really unrelated, but what do you think of the movement of the Philippine X from the Americans from the Philippine from the American race Filipinos.
Oh, Philippines. Is that how you pronounce it? Philippine X?
I've seen
Philippines?
people say it's Philippine X, and I've always thought it was Philippines
I
as
thought
well, like
so
the
too.
Wings Club. Mm.
The X. Um, well, I think, di ba, I remember that when it came out. And I remember the reaction of the Filipinos here is like, what are you doing? The language is already non-gendered, right? Um, and as someone, I'm studying French, and I now understand what they mean about the Philippine language being non-gendered, because if you speak French, chances are every noun has a gender, whether male or female, and it's frustrating. It's very annoying for me. So you speak each. There are different ways of saying verbs and modifiers for each gender, and it gets confusing, especially if you don't know if the noun you're speaking is male or female. Unlike here, right? Bahay is bahay. It has no gender, and so it's a simpler thing. Now, as to the idea of Philippines, or that idea of Philippines, I think the Filipinos in the States are dealing with several issues at the same time. One is their identity, right? One is the crisis of Philippine identity. The other is the crisis of gender, right? That's going on. The idea of the gender has become fluid. The idea of the gender has kind of disassociated itself from biological sex, and so now we have um, we have these two issues happening at the same time. And I wouldn't be surprised if, for Filipino Philippines, for Filipino American, that's uh that's a lot to handle. And so I think the Philippines thing is their way of coping with it. But yun nga, it's a basic misunderstanding of the term Filipino, right? Because diba, there's Filipino in the sense of Filipino, Filipina, and then there's Filipino in the sense of the general uh, nationality. And I don't think we have a problem with Filipino as a genderless term. And given that our language is inherently genderless, it's confusing for us to have to do that, di ba? Kasi sa atin, okay na yun, genderless naman talaga tayo in terms of the way we speak. And yeah, so that's kind of where it is. And that's why there was such weird backlash. I remember people were going, what are the Americans, what are the Filipino Americans doing? What is this? And there was this weird backlash about it na parang you're just showing that you don't understand Philippine culture from here, right? But again, the Filipino American experience is different from the Filipino experience, where we grew up differently. I know this because I've talked with a lot of Filipino American writers, and their experience is very different from us. We grew up, right? We grew up here. Yeah, it's not as sophisticated. We don't have as many cool stuff. Um, we at times often view America with a certain level of envy and longing, that we want some parts of us, or at least of our family. Sometimes we'll go, I want to be an American, or let's go to America, or let's emigrate and stuff like that. And but in terms of our interacting with each other as Filipinos, there was never an issue, right? Because you go to school, everybody's brown, or different shades of brown anyway. Maybe there are a couple of white people, but they're mestizo. Most likely, they're not really foreigners unless you go to an international school. Um, but there is this idea of everybody being the same. And that's a very big difference to the experience of Filipino Americans, because yeah, for a Filipino American who belongs to a minority, there is the possibility that when you go to school, you're the only Filipino in the school, which means that you are alien and you will feel alien. I remember we had this gathering of Filipino American writers who came here and were studying. They were actually doing some research, and so they did a talk in the Rizal Live, and it was an interesting talk because one of the questions was, so what is the how do you find the experience of being in the Philippines? And the one of the writers said that this is one of the times where she feels so comfortable because everybody in the room looks like her, right? Everybody in the room is brown. There is no, you know, there is no sense of I'm the only brown person in the room or I'm the only Filipino in the room. Everybody's Filipino. And there's a sense of community that happens. They feel more comfortable just being themselves. And so you realize that's something that Filipino Americans routinely have to deal with. You go out, and I'm sure if you've been to the States, right? But you feel a little alien because they're white, they're black, right? Maybe there are some brown people, maybe there are some Filipinos, but you don't feel at home, at least not completely, because you're a foreigner. So imagine that, but you live there, diba? So one of the things that these writers were saying to me that what drove them nuts in the States was they could speak English like this. They could speak English perfectly well. The grammar was correct, and they'd get corrected by people simply because the accent is different, simply because maybe their vowels are a little different. We're not as nasal when we pronounce our vowels as they do. And so, um, yeah, they get very annoyed because they grew up there, right? They speak like they do, at least to their ears, they speak like they do, and they will get corrected for their pronunciation. That's one. The other one is the sense of you're not American, and unfortunately, that's true for all of the minorities in the States. You're not American unless you're white, and they had this sense of if I'm not American and I grew up in America, what's where else do I go for identity? And that's why a lot of them go back to the Philippine go back to the Philippines, to their Philippine heritage as a source of identity. And it's an interesting thing that a lot of times they will dress more Filipino than we do, right? I was watching this video, one of those food videos of a restaurant in America, and the chef, it's a Filipino restaurant, and the chef would wear a barong, right? Would wear a stylized Filipino barong. It's short sleeve, it's gray. So it's not naman the formal, pinya or husi, but it's a barong. And he'd wear it with the painter's hat and jeans. And so it's a little weird to me, but I guess that's how he expresses his Filipino-ness, no? Um, so yun. So as for the Philippines thing, I mean, it's I think it's the Filipino Americans trying to find their way, and we can disagree with them linguistically, but I think we have to also let them find their way, right? So that's my thing on it. So anybody else have any question?
Sir,
Go.
my question is about knowing that since each seat during the pre-Spanish colonial time, pre-Spanish time in the Philippines was not really a country, but it's like maybe different kingdoms
Mm.
clumped up together. How did like the people who were compiling stories make sense of differences in each version of like the kingdom's stories?
I think one of the helpful things with that was language. Um, a lot of the kingdoms spoke different languages. So the kingdom of Maynila, right, was Tagalog. Then there would be a kingdom higher up which would speak Ilocano or speak Kapampangan. And so, and of the Spaniards, the Spaniards didn't want to teach Spanish, and so they took efforts to learn our languages. So you had Spaniards who knew Kapampangan and Ilocano and Tagalog and all these things, and they would be the ones who'd compile. So, and masipag, and they were usually priests because the part of the job of the priest was to convert people to Christianity. And so they did that by learning the language. And in the process, they would encounter these stories, and some of them would, you know, um, take those down as a matter of record, not really in terms of literary interest or cultural interest, but because This was the report that they had to give. Na, these people believe this, and this is the story that they have. I think one of the things that one of the most Hispanicized, diba you had epics. The module had some samples of um, Filipino epics, and
Yes, sir.
apparently the epic of the Tagalogs wasn't there because the suspicion is that the epic of Bernardo Carpio, the epic of the Tagalog was Bernardo Carpio. But Bernardo Carpio, because I think the Tagalogs were the most heavily Hispanicized, the Spanish decided to put up their capital there. So that was the most heavily modified of the uh Carpio of the epics. Oh, wait, there's a question on the chat. Let me check it out.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. How do we reconcile Almario's point that we should retrace our pre-colonial history if most of our ancestors' works have been buried since they were passed orally? Well, they're not buried. They're still there. I think a lot of the works are still being passed down orally. The tribes, that's why we're that's why the Philippines is very concerned about um, preserving our tribes, right? Because we're still in the process of archiving these tribes' practices and beliefs. So on one side, yeah, Almario is right in that we should retrace it, and we should understand it from a point of view that's our own. I think that was what we wanted to do, because a lot of times we retrace it, but because we're Western educated and the theories we know are Western, we look at it from that lens. The problem with that is we miss our, personal thinking about it, our personal view. Um, but no, they're not completely buried. There are so many tribes out there that still sustain their beliefs. And if you want to know, that's one of the complications of uh, infrastructure development and industrial development in the Philippines. Here's an example. No? In Baguio, in the Cordillera region, there are projects that are being earmarked, and actually there's money na, there's a awarded company that's supposed to do it to build power plants for the region, right? They're hydroelectric, which means that they will have to dam certain bodies of water to generate power. What's the problem in that? The Cordillera is also home to so many tribes. And the land that's going to be dammed up and therefore flooded and you'll never see it again is the land of the tribes. So that's an ongoing, as of right now, that's an ongoing debate and discussion that on one hand, the Cordillera, which is one of the poorest regions in the country, desperately needs power. And here's the project that can do it. On the other hand, it's going to hit lands that have been considered ancestral for all these tribes. What do we do? And that's something, and there's no answer to that. As of that, literally today, there is no answer to that question. It's still a point of conflict in that area, and you can replicate that throughout the Philippines. And it's not just power. You're talking things like mining. You're talking things like sometimes industrial development, which would benefit these people in the sense that maybe they'll get more jobs, they'll get paid more, they'll earn more, but in the process they lose something. So that's where we are at the moment. That we're struggling with preserving heritage, but at the same time the need to provide better services for the same people. And there's no easy answer to that, right? Which is why it's so slow sometimes, or that's why we develop our things so slowly, because we have to negotiate that. And because if there's one thing that the Philippines is it's aware of the numerous tribes that it has. It's aware of the diversity that it has. And so we try very hard to be respectful of that. But at the same time, how do you do that and still you keep them in poverty in essence? Kasi. So how do we fix that? That's a difficult question to answer. So So there, I think on the how do we reconcile that we should retrace our pre-colonial history, it really boils down to we need people to do the research. And there are people naman who are doing the research. Some of them are Filipino, some of them are not. But it's really just a lot of work. And thank goodness there are people who are willing to do the work there. Go, Santi.
Hi, sir. Oh, what I noticed was interesting was the fact that there was a given that all these readings are pre-colonial before the Spanish,
Yep.
and yet there was a creation story about a flood,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and and it's very interesting how this without even any influence from the Spaniards, we already had a story of some sort of flood.
Yeah. The flood story is not kasi just Christian or Hebrew for that matter. There are flood stories um in many civilizations. And I think the Persians or the Sumerians had flood stories um, as well. And so it's one of those things, you know, that crosses cultures. And that kind of, you know, if you talk to, I don't know if you guys watch this programs, the Ancient Aliens and like History Channel. If you talk to those guys, they'll say because the aliens taught them that, or the aliens, you know, were the ones who told that story. But you know, the fact is, I think it's one of those ideas that um, generate a universal message, and usually it's the same message, rin, that you cannot. The flood is a consequence of something. The flood is a consequence of bad behavior, right? A collective unconscious, possibly yes. Remember that the human race supposedly originated from one town in Africa, right? We've actually been able to trace via genetics our genetic origins, and we came from one town in Africa. So literally, Africa is the cradle of human civilization, and literally, we came from one place. All of us, we came from one place. So if that place happened to have suffered a huge flood, which caused so much suffering, and that story gets retold and retold, right? And as people spread throughout the world, dala nila yung kwento, right? Especially if it's one of those stories that teach an important lesson, then yeah, dadalhin yung kwento wherever it goes. So anything else? Okay. Somebody says, it was really interesting how Filipinos managed to take foreign literary forms and influences and make it our own. The passion, yes. Where are you? We're not there yet.
Oh, sorry, sir. Excited na lang.
Oh, nga. But yeah, the passion. It's fascinating, right? The passion, and you go back to Ray Ileto, whose work Passionate Revolution is still considered one of the epic, um, one of the most influential works. And you realize that by making the passion what it is now or what it was in those times, Filipinos were able to air their grievances without people, without the Spaniards actually noticing, right? We were resonating with the sufferings of Christ. And yeah. And you know, you realize the passion, the pabasa, for example. Have you guys ever heard of pabasa?
Yes, sir.
Diba? The pabasa is Filipino. But it's not, I think, done in other countries.
No, sir.
And and for and for some people, right? Thank goodness it's not done in other countries. The
Yes, sir.
pabasa, diba? The pabasa is this singing reading of the Passion of Christ, and you realize that's probably also tied into our pre-colonial traditions. The awit, you know, we sing it rather than we speak it. And the thing lang is, it's not done very well because it also I suspect there is the element of They're trying to mimic chanting, right? The Gregorian chanting style of the church, but at the same time, you're influenced by your traditional melodies and stuff. It's just weird sounding. Um, I don't know if you've ever taken participated in that. It's strange. It's a strange thing.
Uh,
But
Sir, my
yeah.
family runs like that tradition every year.
So
Cause
do you read?
no, sir, I just uh go there because of family obligation. But my older um my older relatives,
They
like
read.
yes, po.
Eto, di ba wala namang set melody yan?
Sa alam ko po, there is po. It's like goes
Ah.
up,
Yeah,
down.
gumagano, di ba? Ganun lang.
Yes, sir.
Ganun lang. But like walang notes. You don't really have to hit a note to do it. It's just
Yes,
it's
po.
like I know I don't like it either, but it's tradition. There. So wait, somebody saying, I just want to share something. We need to research serve as a bridge between the past and present. The historian as curandera, curator, and it tells us that historians can serve as healers by finding a different point of view aside from the history documented by colonizers. Yes, they do so by talking to people who have been subjugated and giving them and their ancestors voice. Yes, right? That's part of the, well, healing, or other people would say resistance, right? The resistance to the colonial experience that we need to do. I think as a caveat to that is there are some thinkers who say let's return to our pre-Hispanic roots. We can't. I think is the short answer. We can't. We can look back, we can appreciate, we can recover in the sense of that we know things again, but we can't really erase the colonial experience. It's there. So the best we can do is appreciate and have an open mind as to how we can see that that portion of our history better, so that we can appreciate it better and take away more things about ourselves that we really do need to know. I mean, I'll talk about food at a certain point either. Malaika saying, marami pong melody. Yes. Ang alam ko kasi, there's a certain path of the melody for the babasa. There's a path that it follows, but it's not necessarily uh, specific. There are no notes. You don't have sheet music to follow. You just follow a certain rhythm of note of reading.
But
For
sir,
yes.
from what my relatives told me po,
Uh-huh.
like what Malaika says, there is instrumentals, but mostly it's also done through teaching. That
Yeah.
there are some people who are being taught by old women how to do pabasa in certain
Yes. Yes.
specific ways.
True. So like Malaika was saying, sa kanila may instrumentals pa. Right? But yun nga because it's not written down, a lot of these people don't know how to write sheet music for one thing. So you don't have a record. You just have what you hear. And unfortunately, as we know, a lot of people aren't pitch perfect. So you will hear different different notes. And so it becomes varied. But that's an interesting part of our how we've kind of quote unquote Filipinized the Catholic faith, right? That's one. The other one is, oh, by the way, it's Christmas, so Merry Christmas, right? Good Lord, is what I'm saying. It's like, oh my God, it's Christmas again. And we're known for celebrating the longest Christmas season in the world. And actually, it's not as bad as, let's say, previous years. Because if you go in previous years, you will actually go to malls. And now, no, in September, you'll hear Christmas music. And that used to drive me nuts. Okay, wait, somebody's saying it's just interesting to see how the ethics are also reflective of the society where they originate. Yes. Didn't know polygamy was a thing during pre-colonial times. Well, yes. We didn't really the idea of one man, one woman is a very Christian thing. It's a very Christian idea. The wife having one wife. And yeah, So many having multiple spouses, multiple partners was something that was pretty common. It actually was more dependent, as is with Islam, it's more dependent on your capacity to support, right? So if you the idea therefore is that if you want to have multiple families, then you better be able to support multiple families. Diba? Uh don't bite off more than you can chew, as they say. Oh, somebody's quite late. Hi, Luke. Good morning, Luke. I hope you're okay. So, anything else? Oh wait, somebody's writing. Okay. There's something melancholy about the speech of Almaria, especially at the mention of the poem Bangkay, because it truly reflects multiple traditions and cultures that remain nameless and unidentified because of the entrance of colonizers in the country. I found it saddening then that many of those who peer through the oral traditions of the Philippines are more inclined to translate it into English rather than the different vernacular languages of the country to allow it to be truly appreciated by the race of people who should feel most akin to it. The idea of a facade or imagination through English translated works is something that feels all too real for many tribal oral traditions that historians feel inclined to translate into a foreign language. There are a couple of things that are happening kasi with that. One, um, as I think I've mentioned before, our national language, Filipino, is not yet fully developed. It is still mostly Tagalog. And when Filipino was conceptualized, the idea was that it would take from the major languages of the Philippines and kind of amalgamate it into a national language. That has not really happened. That's one. Number two, the reason why English, and therefore English is the common language, right? That's one. Number two, a lot of these guys publish abroad. A lot of the researchers publish abroad. And so there is the need to translate it into a language that will be read by the audience abroad. Again, we're going back to the problem of readership in the Philippines, right? Not a lot of people will read those things here. And you have the additional problem of the sheer number of languages that we have. Imagine having to translate, let's say, one epic into what? Let's say, just just for example, no, Cebuano, Ilocano, Tagalog, three. But you also have, so those would cover a lot, right? Then you have Ilonggo, right, or Bisaya, and then you have the smaller languages. You have Kapampangan, you have Bicolano, you have Waray, you have Hiligaynon, you have, and you realize we have hundreds of languages. And so you realize that the translation project itself is enormous, right? And you need a lot of people to do it. And again, uh, humanities research in the Philippines is a very rich field, but unfortunately, it's not a very lucrative field, in the sense that you're not really going to be paid a lot to do a lot of these research. So for a lot of scholars, they're going to go where they will get more of a return, right? For some, yes, it's a passion and they can get grants for it, but unfortunately not enough for now. We do hope that it gets better. I do sincerely hope that we do get more research, uh, more people interested in doing that kind of work because it is fascinating stuff. Anyone else? Yes, Jubel.
Sir, I just realized that, for example, like the origins of like horror stories, I would say, it really harkens back to the history of um Spanish colonization, since back then in pre-colonial times, 'di ba sir, they regarded women and um gender fluid, I would say, na mga babaylan They
Mm.
would regard them in a high position, ganyan. Kasi they feel that all the Filipinos would feel that all their gods are emulate feminine energy or emulate like feminine some divine intervention. And so they ask these people, yung mga babaylan, for guidance, ganyan, for advice. But then when the Spaniards came, I think it like a lot of Filipinos questioned bakit yung mga nagahari yung mga lalaki. And it was just like a genuine question. And so I think, I'm not so sure if I learned this from a class, but I think Spanish people, what happened was they sort of demonized these people. So they said na parang, it became a rise of homophobia, like parang men who emulate feminine energy aren't supposed to be leaders. Women shouldn't be leaders, and so thus aswang and sadako and other stuff. So yeah, I think it also is still reflective of today. Kasi even if back then na parang the pre-colonial Filipinos regarded women, in a higher position, I think now it reflects that how I guess I would say brainwashed Filipinos were with the idea of misogyny and homophobia. I think that's sad, but at the same time, it also enriched like our horror literature in a way. So yeah.
Oh, interesting. There's actually like written documents about that, no? Again, because you had the Spanish clergy doing research on the Philippines when they arrived, and of course they encountered the folklore, and they encountered the monsters, right? That we had. And if you look across the Southeast Asian region, Indonesia, Malaysia, particularly Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, we have very similar monsters, right? We have versions of Sigbin, Aswang, and what do you call it? Manananggal, right? There are versions of it across Southeast Asia. There's a very big difference between the versions of other countries and the Philippine versions, particularly with the Manananggal. And the Manananggal in other countries is a head with wings, right? It does the same thing. It's a viscera sucker. So it preys on pregnant women and they suck out the babies with the long tongue, right? The same process. The difference is it's a head, right? When instead of a half body, it's just a head. Number one. Number two, it's there's no clear gender to the manananggal. The manananggal can be male or female. It's only in the Philippines where the manananggal is almost exclusively female. You don't hear of stories where the manananggal is male. And that's because the manananggal was used by the Spanish clergy as a way of, as you said, demonizing the babaylan. The babaylan kasi, because they were the spiritual leaders of the tribes, no? They were the priests, ika nga, of the tribes. So of course, when the Spaniards are saying your beliefs are wrong and that's the work of the devil and all that stuff, of course the first thing you do is, if it's a white stranger telling me this, I'm gonna talk to my spiritual leader and ask that person, is that person making any sense? And of course their beliefs are gonna clash, right? And one of the greatest sources of early resistance in in conversion was the babaylan, right? And so the Spaniards had to find a way of discrediting the babaylan, and they did it by equating the babaylan with the manananggal. So they started spreading stories that talked about how these women, right, would split in half and fly and do that and do all those things. So that's why the manananggal is female, right? In the Philippines. But yeah, there is this. And as for misogyny, I think it goes further back kasi for Europe eh. It goes back to like medieval times when, or even before that pa, that males were always seen to be the stronger ones, right? So women were the ones who were left at home. Ika nga. Eh, very different kasi yung life, right? Yung culture. But here, women and men, also because our lives were different. We existed differently. Women and men had more um, equal roles in society. There was a recognition of the wisdom of the woman, the nurturing nature of the woman, and um, hence the role of the babaylan. Right? You had the datu and you had the babaylan. The datu is male, the babaylan is female. Both of them are seen as equally important in pre-Hispanic society. And we didn't completely lose that. I mean, it gets, I guess the term is sublimated. It's underneath our surface belief. So for example, di ba, ang ulo ng tahanan, sino ulo ng tahanan? Head of the family. Yeah, English. So you guys can understand. Who's the head of the family? The father. Sino ang haligi ng tahanan? Who is the pillar of the family? The mother, right? And so, on one hand, you have the head, but the person who holds things up is the mother. And in a lot of Filipino households, there is a quiet, not explicit normally, recognition that in the house, it is the mother who is in charge, right? For a lot of families, for example, the dad is the one who works and he'll bring home the money, but he gives the money to the mom, and the mom is the one who takes care of the household expenses, of disbursing the funds. And so, who is in control of the family? It's not the father, although the mother will defer to the father in terms of decision making. But who's managing the house? It's the mother, right? So there is this, we still actually recognize a matriarchal hierarchy in the family. It's just that it's not normally explicitly said, right? Um, and normally, I don't know if it's true for your families, but normally this happens more commonly in lower income families. And I know this because I have people who used to work for my dad, for example. Whenever they get their payroll, they would already set aside the money they give to their wives, and then they set aside the money that they give to themselves so that they have some money to drink with. But the thing is, there was that function of I have to give the money to my wife, right? So there, I think that yeah, there is that. The other thing is the the not misogyny but the homophobia that the religion kind of brought over as well. No? Babaylans were not always female. Sometimes they were male, but they were effeminate. And so if they were an effeminate male, as Juvel said, an effeminate male would exude feminine energy and they can be recognized as babaylan as well. And if they are, then they will dress up like a female. They will dress up like a babaylan and they will do the same function. Um, yeah, religion kind of messed us up there. We inherited the biases, you might say, and the idea of machismo, for example, that a lot of Catholic countries have. I mean, if you look at Spain, or Spain, not Spain, you look at Mexico and Latin America, you look at the Philippines, the behavior of the men are very similar because same faith, same culture, macho, tough guy, right? Look at Duterte, for example. Um, there's still a premium being put on that. The idea of the tough guy, the guy who can take everything and stand up. Um, and therefore the effeminate male or the homosexual is seen as weak. Thank goodness that's changing. No? I think the other thing about the Philippines is it's one of the more, not to say it's great, but it's one of the more tolerant countries in the world for homosexuality, I think. So that's something we have going for us. And I guess that goes back also to the idea that in the end, we did recognize them as not as okay, right? That's fine. There was no issue with being a homosexual or being uh, uh, effeminate there. Does anybody else have anything to say? No, we're very quiet now. What happened?
Sir, just
Go.
going off the tangent of horror stories lang po.
I'll go.
I've read somewhere on the internet, I don't know if it's true, that in World War II, Americans used the idea of an aswang to like either scare the Japanese or the Filipinos. Either one of the two, I can't distinctly remember. But I found that interesting in the sense that mythologies can still be used as like a weapon, like psychological warfare weapon against different people.
It
If
was,
yes,
yeah,
sir.
it was done by what's his
Oh,
name?
I feel like I don't know why na. Medyo nagdagdagan yung word from when it comes to campus. I think
Yeah,
it's
it
because of
sorry. It was done by a guy named Edward Lansdale. Lansdale. And Edward Lansdale was a CIA operative in the Philippines after World War II. This is after World War II. And he actually wrote about it in his book. He has a book about it. And so um, he the problem was um, the resistance of with the Japanese, the Philippine resistance, which was called the Hook Balahap, right? I don't know you know this from Philippine history, right? Hook Balahap, which is Hukbong Bayan Laban sa Hapon, the the national army against the Japanese. For those of us who are not Filipino, right? The Hook Balahap was the resistance movements against the Japanese during World War II. And when World War II ended, the Huk Balahap found itself getting radicalized by communists. And so the Huk Balahap was transforming into a communist um, resistance and a communist insurrection. And the CIA recognized this. And so what happens was instead of the Huk Balahap fighting um, the Japanese, they were starting to fight the Philippine government and the Americans, for that matter. And so Lansdale um, thought up a very interesting strategy to try and uh, discourage people from joining the movement. And what he does, according to him, is that they would kidnap a hook member, a known hook member, puncture his neck with two holes. I'm reading from an article. Hang his body by the heels, drain him of blood, and then dump the corpse on a trail that the other hooks would pass by. Right? And that would of course scare the hooks, right? So and yeah, I puncture it here because Lansdale is coming from the idea of vampire, so that's actually not how an S1 would work. But anyway, it worked, right? They scared the hooks from recruitment and would scare the hawks away, so moving them further and further away from the city centers and into the mountains. Right? Yes, how absolutely charming. And he boasted about this. And apparently, another thing that they would do is if there were Hook sympathizers in the town, for example, they would in the middle of the night go to that person's house and paint an evil eye right on the door, right, to scare people. And so in the morning when they see that there's an evil eye on the door, like, oh my God. And then because Filipinos are suspicious, people go, oh my God, there's a devil, whatever, whatever. And so, discouraging again people from joining the hook. So it worked to a degree, right? And at the end, by 1954, the Hope movement was done. It ended, right? It was seen as a success, right? And according to the article I'm reading, it's because they were thinking of the idea of communism as a godless movement, and so it's evil and therefore should be stopped, right? And that kind of is the belief they have, kind of up to today, which is strange. Number one, number two, we see it here, right? We see vestiges of that, um, not naman unfounded, no, suspicion of communism in the Philippines, right? We still see people being very wary of people who claim to be socialists or communists, partially because of, well, what's happened in the past. And let's face it, the NPA has actually not made their names any better in all these years of fighting, uh, simply because of the violent nature of their resistance. So there, but yeah, that's not actually an urban legend, and it's not a conspiracy theory. That was true. Edward Lansdale actually did do that. It contributed to the idea of the aswang as this monster, which is also, I think, partially why of the ghouls we have, the aswang is the most present in our consciousness. Yun. Truth nga, if you well, Yawa, yeah, Yawa, which is actually not demon, right? Yawa is not demon, but yeah, pisting Yawa, right? Um, Yawa is a god, right? Goddess.
Goddess, sir, like part of the epic of Labaw Donggon, and like
Yeah.
she was seen as a seductress when she was just a loving wife, actually.
Yes, and right. That's also part of the uh, how interventions that have happened with our mythology over time. But there, so yeah, so it's interesting that with Trece, for example, reviving, or at least not reviving, but showcasing more of these Filipino creatures in an international setting. Uh, how do we navigate, right? Going back to Almaria's question, kasi no, Trece is not the creatures and the mythology in Trece. It's not the mythology of the traditional Filipino pre-Hispanic uh, pre-Hispanic tribes. These are already intervened with or mediated. They've been modernized and westernized and all of that. So on one hand, I'm happy that it's happening. On the other hand, um, we should know that Trece is not the only interpretation of these things, that we can have other ways of writing about it. That will still be um, true to or authentic in terms of it being Filipino. And I do sincerely hope that we see more of that. I mean, we kind of get stuck with Aswang, but there are so many other things. Like I love our gods and goddesses. I think the stories that they have are fascinating, and there's so many, right? Because now we were multiple regions, we have multiple gods and goddesses, sometimes of the same thing, and that would be an interesting thing. We don't have to lump them all together. Some people have tried kasi to lump all of these different gods and goddesses of different cultures or different tribes together. It's not going to work because you'll have overlapping, right? You'll have overlapping roles. So I'm just happy to have all of them around, and you can just explore them and say this is from this region, this is from that region. Diba? Like why do we need to lump it all together when they're not supposed to be? So anything else? Binukot. Sige, Sean, explain.
Sir, I think this plays more onto your earlier statement of how the Philippines was once a kingdom and we had all the rulers, like the high standing people. So there's this binukot. It's like a kept woman, but actually it's more than just that, because this in the tribe there they would have this prediction that, oh, like Sir Roy Agustin will have and his wife will have the most beautiful child, and then we will raise that child into someone that will never see the that will never step on the ground, will never be will never touch the sun, the skin will never touch the sunlight, and will have like maidens that will help her, but in exchange she will have to learn the cultures and traditions, like the oral traditions that will be passed down. And then yeah, it's very interesting. And then she can't be seen by men, and then after that she will require a dowry if ever someone is interested in taking her hand. But then during the process of courtship, the guy won't be able to see her. No
Yeah.
guy will be able to see her.
So yun nga, like a special, like a princess. Diba? But if you notice, diba, there's a, yeah, the idea of reincarnation, right? Which is something that is in a lot of our cultures, Asian cultures, but it's kind of been erased by Catholicism. We can't reincarnate. We are one life only. Right? And all that stuff. But yeah, I think I want to read more about that. I think. You know what? I haven't read about that much. Hmm.
Actually, Sir, Yawa is said to be a binukot. So she's like an indigenous princess or something like that.
Who became a goddess?
Yeah, she has power, so it's more on
Yeah.
speculative fiction.
Well, I know, and then that's fascinating, diba? So we have all these things that we can play with, right? And yeah, I want to read more about that. Unfortunately, it's not easy to read about stuff unless you go on the internet a lot. And like, well, I have other stuff to do. Maybe I'll get to it as we're doing this, and I'll read about that next week. Anything else, guys? We're about. I'm giving us another 5 minutes, and then I wish I had like the Ateneo bell so I can play it just so it feels a little more like class. But it's okay. I don't. I know some people get triggered by that too. So, any other things you want to share before we wrap up? Just to remind you guys, we have a couple of non-Filipino students in our class. So this I hope it's interesting to them, right? Somebody just gave me the bell. Thanks, Sandy. Um, but so sometimes like when I code switch, when I speak in Filipino, I hope that you guys can follow. If you don't, just let me know so I can translate it into English. If you speak Filipino, that's great. I know that it's not too far away from, well, it's not close, but it's at least closer to Bahasa than other languages. Um, so, what else? Yes, sir, it's very interesting but confusing sometimes when we mix a language. Yeah, I know. That's why I realized, oh, you're right, there are some non-Filipinos here. So yeah, so we'll try to make sure that we translate. And if you guys need clarification on any of the terms we use, then let us know. So like binukot, for example, that's a term that's also new to me. So I'm learning that too. Thank you, Sean, for sharing that with us. Um, okay, I've been thinking about this thing kanina pa. You said Yawa, right? And Yawa as a goddess instead of a demon. There's also and this is an art motif, the Naga, right? Which is a Southeast Asian artistic motif. Oh, let me see if I can get a picture of it. The Naga is it's actually a serpent, right?
Sir.
And yes. Yes.
Sir, it's been depicted in multiple certain medias. So that's why maybe some of us are familiar. As Santi pointed out, it was used in Warcraft as a race. Um,
Yes. You're right. And it's actually this. I don't know if you've ever seen it kasi in our art, but it's actually this. Let me share the screen real quick. You see it? You see this? I'm pretty sure you guys
sir,
have seen.
it's not sharing on screen, sir.
It's not. Wait, sorry. Share screen. There. You see it now?
Yes, sir.
See this? This is often seen as mistakenly seen as sari manok, right? It's not. It's the naga. See, it's a serpent. This is very present in Filipino architecture. See, Mindanao in particular. But therefore, right, the idea of naga or the serpent is something that is very present um, in our architecture and therefore in our culture, right? People keep mistaking it for the chicken. It's not the chicken. It's actually a different creature altogether. But I've always found it fascinating that we have things like that, and yet we don't really. Yeah, it looks like it's smaller though. It looks like bakunawa. It's smaller though, but there and that's present in architecture. We see it, especially in Mindanao architecture. You'll see those things on the houses, and people kind of used to mistake them. They say it's a sari manok or a different creature. No, it's actually the naga. And then, diba, you see it, and then you see the connection, right? The naga is in Warcraft also, right? And they're also serpents. So some aspects of our culture kind of jump out and run away and get seen. I think partially because it's also a um, it's not just Filipino. Uh, it's I think partially Islamic, partially Southeast Asian. Hence it spreads faster. But to me, I just found that fascinating that there are things like that that kind of pop out and appear in the international culture, and sometimes you don't know that it's part of our culture too. So there. Um, it's about a couple of minutes away. Last call for anything else you want to share for today. Or are you guys hungry now? Somebody's hungry. Uh, I don't blame you. I haven't had breakfast myself. So I'll tell you what, why don't we, well, it's just about 9:20. Why don't we end the session for today? And I will see you guys again next week. We'll still be talking about module 1. If you guys want to share other stuff, not just the stuff that you've read on the module, but also maybe stuff that you've encountered outside of the class. So, for example, you read it in an earlier course, or perhaps it's part of what your family has as a collection. I'd be happy to see it, right? And we can all talk about it in class. But if there's nothing else, then I will see you guys again next week, same time. Thank you. It was another very fruitful discussion. It was fun. I hope you guys had fun too.
Yes, naman, sir.
Thank you. And well, have a great weekend. It's sunny out for once, so hopefully you guys can get some sunlight. Uh, I don't really know what CQ we are in, but hey, stay safe anyway.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.